there's a bit of echo. Should be better now. So hello everyone. I want to welcome you to another lecture for ShenZhen. But it seems like we are having a bit of trouble with echo. Give me a second. I'll just do it from this one. I hope everyone can hear me now. And I would encourage our students also turn on their cameras so we can all kind of participate in this lecture and see each other, at least for this introduction. I want to welcome you all to basically the last keynote lecture for this year's ShenZhen. My name is Igor Pantic, and as Sumin already told you, I would be moderating today's session. And it is my pleasure to welcome Deborah Lopez and Hadin Charbel for today's lecture. Deborah and Hadin are architects and founders of Parade, an interdisciplinary design and architecture research studio located in London, UK. Their work adopts approaches from various fields and contexts, addressing topics related to climate, ecology, human perception, machine sentience, and their capacity for altering current modes of existence through imminent fictions. They currently teach at the Bartlett B-Pro, leading Research Cluster 1 under the title of Monumental Wastelands, with a focus on the current effects and near future ramifications of permafrost thaw. Previously, they were adjunct professors and second-year coordinators at INDA Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. And their research and work has been presented and exhibited internationally, including events such as Acadia, Tenkarte, Seoul Biennale. They've been exhibited at the Centre Pompidou in Paris as well. And their project Follicle, a toxic cartography for Bangkok, was recently exhibited in the Royal Academy of Arts in London as part of Ecovisionary Symposium, and it will be the part of Spanish Pavilion in the next year's Venice Biennale. So with this, I would like to welcome Deborah and Hadin, and please take over.
Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you so much. Can you hear both of us all right? Okay.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so Hadin, are you going to share a screen?
Yes. Does that work? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, nice. So, hello. As Igor was introducing, our names are Deborah Lopez and Hadin Charbel. We are both architects and teaching at the Bartlett B-Pro program. Normally, we are teaching and working in London, but currently we are in between Spain and Los Angeles. And together we run an architectural design studio called Parade that tackles between research and projects that are oftentimes carried out by methods or collaborations with other disciplines. The studio, or at least how we conceive of it, is something transformative and nomadic, and through various interfaces and mediums tries to render the changing views of the environment around us or our interpretations of it. We will try to explain this through the title of the lecture, Between Signal and Noise. And basically, if signal is something meaningful, some kind of information that someone is trying to detect, then noise could be considered as something that is random and unwanted, that interferes with the signal. So in this case, we understand that there is a degree of subjectivity in treating something as a signal or noise, which also implies some degrees of resolution.
So elaborating on this idea, we'd like to talk about this following example, where on July 25th, 1976, the Viking 1 orbiter took a series of photographs of the Cydonia region on Mars, which were batch processed and released to the public. Within these images that were released, there's a certain area that starts to look a little bit like a face. So amongst all these crevices and craters and mounds and valleys, the one that kind of stood out as a face is the one that people remember, and it's the one that becomes referred to as the face on Mars, which is this over here. But then some odd years later, there was the Mars Global Surveyor, and it recorded another set of images. So there you can see it on the left, and some of the batch processed images on the right, with a higher resolution and a more accurate data processing. But in this case, then the registration on the face is actually lost. So the face on Mars became faceless. So with this little anecdote, there are several curiosities that emerge from the history, kind of this transition from something appearing to be a signal and then actually just becoming some kind of noise, or it was noise that was made into a signal. But that kind of deals with some of the topics that we're interested in, related to human perception, affection, and essentially these fuzzy thresholds. What we think they can do is destabilize singular dominant narratives and offer other ways of reading and ultimately being, which have implications across things like the human body and fabrication, ecologies, territorialization, which we explore through our work and our teaching. So moving on with this idea of operating somewhere between signal and noise, we can start with one of our early projects called Toka, which we did during our master's studies at the University of Tokyo. And this is basically where we first started overturning conventional fabrication processes and the idea of a predetermined ideal output. The argument that we were making here was that if humans are basically not precise and will never be as precise as machines, then why don't we just let them continue to be imprecise and see in what ways we can use that as a generative or desirable output. So we started by looking at the anatomy of each human and understanding the types of movements that are kind of generic in a way, right? So here you can see each person swinging their arm from bottom left to top right. And you can see below how more or less they're the same movements, but because physiology, each person has a different kind of tendency. And even the same person repeating the same movements over and over will never really produce that same exact movement, right? This is somehow fundamentally different than a machine, and how a machine can kind of execute the same thing over and over. So with that, we decided that why not take these variations in people's behaviors and kind of pair them up with each other in order to make geometric units, in this case, a kind of X. So what you see here is one person's left paired with somebody else's right in that same arm swinging motion. And where they meet in the middle is this kind of kissing moment. We borrowed principles of choreography because basically when you're thinking about organizing people in a workflow, there's maybe two different ways. One is kind of a super Fordian production line way where everybody is situated in their place and things come to them and they repeat the same tasks. But in choreography, you can be a little bit more mobile and you can still organize people spatially through a different set of rules. So we kind of looked at choreography to understand how could we organize people's movements on site. and how can we repeat certain movements in order to make generative outcomes. So here's the first early test, very primitive test, looking at how we could translate a fixed computer geometry, in this case just a very basic buffet surface, how that would translate into this population of human generated forms. And then to do that, of course, we had to find the right kind of material that would basically freeze human movements in real time almost. And so that was done with a spray foam and a steel mesh. And we had a custom tool that would basically allow you to deploy the materials, the steel mesh kind of encasing the foam as it's being sprayed out. And then solidifying it into that geometry. And kind of this idea of having, because we're talking about building something at a large scale, it needs to be able to stand. But at the same time, we're trying to embrace these imprecisions. So what we did was we came up with this kind of feedback loop that, let's say, mitigates or moderates or negotiates the differences between the target geometry and the actual geometry. So this infinity loop is playing with what was intended and what ended up happening and how we can constantly update one with the other. So in essence, we would have this computer generated geometry here. And with that, we would kind of use the AR markers to indicate for people where they ought to stand. And from there, they would perform their movements and complete a ring. And from that ring, we would then scan the vertices of that X and basically get the deviation where what did we intend to spray and what did we actually end up spraying. And from there, we would calculate a new set of options. And from those options, we would kind of redeploy people on site. So this kind of explains the overview. And because we were talking about building with humans on site, we kind of devised a way to also bypass scaffolding. So we could just kind of lift each layer up because it was super lightweight and just kind of stack them on top of each other. And here you can see the overlay of the different possible outcomes. So with each layer that was sprayed, a new possible outcome was generated until we finally got the final one. So on the left, you have a 3D print of the original geometry, and on the right, you have a 3D print of the one that was actually made. Interestingly enough, this error here was actually a kind of calibration error. So, but it was interesting because even though there was kind of a mistake, a quite significant mistake, the system kind of was able to adapt this error into the final built output. And when you look at these structurally speaking, blue indicating structurally sound and red not so great, you can see that they're more or less similar. So for us, it kind of raises questions about the role of, let's say, humans in fabrication, but then also the kind of difference in quality and expectation of output. And things like this, which was a accidental moment, provided a kind of new way that was, for entering the structure that wasn't necessarily predetermined. So if that was kind of looking at the body as a generative physiology for building, then what we wanted to do next was kind of look at the body in a different way, maybe one that has to do more with its emotional aspects. So one thing that's kind of interesting about the human emotions is that they're kind of withdrawn. So we process these emotions interiorly, but they're obviously influenced by exterior stimuli, and they kind of feed back off each other. So we want to extend this type of behavior into objects and architecture as a way of exploring this boundary between relational and autonomous existence, which was materialized in the form of a sentient and responsive landscape object that could read, interpret, communicate, and also remain partly withdrawn. So in order to read the human input, It was fitted with various biometric sensors, such as a heart rate monitor, a galvanic skin response sensor, and a webcam for expression recognition. So the idea here being that human emotions are, of course, a very complex thing, but what we can do is we can pick up on these signals, right? Kind of a smile and a kind of certain measurement in your heartbeat might be indicative of a certain emotional state. So the idea is that we would be able to somehow measure valence and arousal and determine that emotional state. And from those different values, here we have kind of a behind the scenes shot of what was actually going on. So in this container, we have the foggers that would eject the smoke. Here in the plan, you can see how they're distributed. The artificial flowers. We have the team kind of working on soldering and putting together all the electronics. And here you can see the happy Deborah and the happy emoji. So that was kind of nice to see those working together. But yeah, so the idea being that from those different values, we could give the landscape a kind of autonomy to respond with various degrees of fog and various degrees of color changes that would then influence the human. And then the human would then again influence the landscape, and they would start kind of dialoguing with each other. But we also made it a point to make sure that no two readings could ever be the same. So that would mean something like just because at this particular moment, maybe the person is measuring level A in heartbeat and level B in facial expression, the next time that happens, the landscape would avoid repeating the same kind of outcome. The idea being that we didn't want the landscape to become kind of susceptible to human control or prediction. So we had to find a way to kind of create, let's say, a little bit of noise in the system, which would kind of give the landscape a bit of autonomy and not allow it to be controlled. Right, so the geometry of the landscape was also modeled off of various common human postures. So this is kind of borrowing from Gibson's theory of affordance. So here you can see all these different postures that are overlaid, but at the end of the day, when you look at the landscape by itself, it doesn't necessarily tell you how you ought to sit in it or how you ought to engage it. It's just kind of suggestive, but it's still very much open to interpretation. And that's still somehow an important aspect when we're trying to think about this idea of signal and noise and kind of flexibility or an openness to interpretation. Yeah, so there's the landscape at full scale. Yeah, and here you can see the kind of performer who was not really given any indication. This was kind of part of the experiment. We simply told her, please just enter the landscape and feel free to organize yourself however you please, however you fit. You can touch whatever you want, you can play with whatever you want, and let's just kind of see what happens. So that was also a kind of interesting aspect of working outside of architecture, but kind of reaching more into performance for a brief moment. And in this particular instance, the point was definitely to remain a little bit open-ended, meaning we didn't have a very clear goal in mind as a desired outcome, but instead it was just an exploration and a question into how do we engage with the things around us? How can we create affection between humans and objects? And how can we design in a way that, of course, embraces kind of the humanness of things, but doesn't render them in a kind of hierarchical relationship. Deborah?
Okay, yeah, I was talking with being muted. So if the romantic was about reading the body at the individual and emotional level, then Follicle, which is the next project we are going to present, will be seen as a parallel of that, which is looking at multiple individual bodies and the city in which they inhabit. So what we are seeing here are two views of Bangkok Bangkok skyline on a clear day. And here are the same two views in a more recent days, where the haze and pollution has made itself clear in its capacity to modify our perception of the city, literally disappearing the buildings from our field of view. And this presents a synchronous and biased moment that is shared among all of the inhabitants. And the media and social conversations are exchanged, trying to sort out possibilities, concerns, and ways of action through various facts, figures, and pollution data application, there is a question here of what role architecture plays in reassembling the collective in a moment of spontaneity. So we began questioning if those very bodies that move, breathe, inhabit, and navigate the various territories of the city could not be understood as some form of environmental records in themselves. Not only that, but in what ways do our consuming and shedding bodies produce a material that can be reappropriated into architectural applications. So along these lines, we began exploring human hair, which culturally and historically has its various interpretations, value, and significance, even in the present day. Materially, it is something that we grow, stylize, cut, and discard repeatedly, and although biodegradable, at this moment it is treated as the most trash and dumped into a non-discriminate pile of mixed and wanted waste. However, if we have a closer examination, hair is a complex matrix that retains the elements that the body secrete, such as heavy metals. And with this, we began developing follicle, which is still an ongoing, our longest project to date. So the idea was to use discarded human hair as an architectural material that is both sustainable and inherently possessing some degree of affection. In the construction of a pavilion that will be used as an experimental laboratory and parliament in order to map the city's toxicity into what we called a toxic cartography. The pavilion itself operated as a vehicle where the public could enter and voluntarily participate in a protocol for hair sampling. A device at the center contained a questionnaire, a pair of scissors, mirrors, and everything more or less necessary to anonymously provide a hair sample. And once the samples were collected, they were then sent to a toxicologist to be analyzed. And the data from which we use in the production of an online publicly accessible toxic cartography. So here, what we are seeing are different samples with questionnaires asking people where they live, where they work, what type of environment it is, if it is inside or outside. And by the end of the event, we got up to 200 samples. And now we are at the moment that we have received 50 results from those samples and with some initial insights, as well as 50 samples that are being analyzed. It is important to note that follicle was possible to achieve through collaborations on different sites. Matter Trust, as an NGO, was is actually working repurposing human hair and provide us the means and the felting machine, the hair felting machine. The doctor and Professor Alberto Salomoni, a chemist teaching at the University of Turin in Italy, who was overseeing the hair analysis and consulting us on the interpretation of the data. Touched by an Angel, which basically was a hair donation company, which donated us with the hair. And of course, Bangkok public, who surprisingly was very keen and happy to provide their hair in order to be analyzed. And the idea, yes, I think these are some details of the hair. So this idea of the architecture as a moment for collection and the collective was further developed in Pylonesque, which this time was examining water as a resource and his climatic counterparts such as monsoons, droughts, and climate. And this is especially relevant in the context of rural Thailand. Can you go back one, Hadin, please? Then what we are seeing is that the red dot on the bottom is Bangkok, and the red dot on the top of the page is the site where we were, no? Which we found interesting because it is basically sandwiched between a building and a garden. So the school hosts 2 generations of students in one campus, which implies various timetables and activities that are sometimes independent, sometimes overlapping. And basically what was in need, it was of a canteen. As you can see here, there is a student getting lunch, but there was not a space to it. So we began considering on how this open-ended space could remain flexible while mediating the specifics of its ecological context, especially with respect to his more valuable resource, which was water. Another interesting set of constraints was the limitation in machinery and labor, and everything had to be mounted by hand and mounted with just a few people, then which basically influenced how the geometry and the structure had to be at the same time as a scaffolding. Here we are looking at the exposed structure made up of a series of modules with two inverted umbrellas in its core. And here is the roofing of the building, which basically works as two large panels. Then the exploded axo shows the relationship between the structure and his performance. And the water is brought into the building, is basically visible and guided through two embedded channels, which lead to a water filtration tank, and in the garden, hosting a combination of endemic plants to be viewed or interacting with various pockets and pathways. Here is where we see the plants with some endemic plants. And basically the plan echoes this multifunction mediation, having no clear front or back, and prompts various forms of connectivity, both visual and physical. Here, for instance, we are looking from the edge at the adjacent building through the structure and towards the garden. And this hybrid typology, which we referred, basically what happened is that through going through the school, we realized that we came across like all of this scattered gym equipment, which we refurbished and connected to a series of pumps, creating a relationship between the garden and the exercise. And what we call this typology is basically a gardenasium, which curiously enough would work quite well. So the strategy was that instead of needing electricity or trying to basically pull the water tanks on the top part, through the exercise, we were bypassing all of this and we were activating all of the water pumps through the exercising machine. And the diagram shows the overall ecosystem of the project, from water collection to water filtration, and activated to the gym and water in the garden. We also designed the furniture with the same spirit, trying for the students and for the instructors and the professors to try to somehow that these multiple activities that had to be happening to be able to somehow be enhanced through the furniture that we designed. So the look and performance of the project was a little bit pylon-esque, nodding on the surrounding electrical pylons and water towers that created a sense of industrial vernacular, which is how the project got its name. And yeah, and this basically somehow reconceptualized a multifaceted ecology, providing a series of possibilities for action and interaction. Some of the images of the water towers and so on. So basically all of this builds into the topic of our research and teaching at Research Cluster 1 at the Bartlett BPro, which we entitled as Monumental Wastelands. And originally, the 9 points of monumentality published in 1943 define as a monument intended to outlive the period which originated them and constitute a heritage for future generations, forming a link between the past and the future. So if in 1937, the World's Fair in Paris saw the two largest European towers face off in a battle of what we were to be monuments in a pavilion form, in a kind of monumentality, that the authors of the 9 points later critiqued as lacking expression of man's highest cultural needs. With this and their contemporary lens, we question if we haven't already begun, are still in the process of making new forms of monument through our collectivity. After all, they are not conscious or intended intention. Our collective action, our collective actions, wants and in some way cultural needs, and there are some forms of monument to be recognized.
So for this year, the research that we are focusing on specifically is in the Arctic, under the lens of permafrost thaw. So the idea that ice is simply melting has huge implications across humans, non-humans, the ecology, and the economy at local and global scales. So to some extent, each of the teams are actually looking at the same thing, which is just how is ice melting affecting whatever it is, but from different protagonists' standpoints. And all of them are going through a process of decoding and recoding using machine learning, sentient machines, and networking human and non-human actors. So this is a view of the Arctic Circle and different zones that have different degrees of permafrost. And basically the first team will maybe just give you an overview of how each of the teams are kind of evolving in parallel, but also in a very different way. So the human team, knowledge offload and reapply, they're basically focusing on human perception and how different kinds of ice and ice formations are used as a formal and a navigational language through traditional Inuit knowledge. So while we, let's say, mostly probably everybody here has a kind of very limited way of describing or understanding ice, to Inuit, two pieces of the same looking kind of ice might have very different meanings in terms of its structural capacity, when it was formed, its biological makeup, its drinkability, and etc. So basically the team is kind of developing a language of ice carving that can be read as a low resolution map that allows the Inuit to continue their kind of activities throughout this changing Arctic environment. So some of that, as we mentioned, has to do with kind of navigating the Arctic or reading the Arctic in different ways. Here you can see the kind of ice training data set or image data set where they're training the machine to recognize and identify. So that's the idea of offloading human knowledge into the machine. And here you can see how they're kind of using a style transfer to embed different types of information in a kind of codified way onto an ice carving pattern to make these landmarks and make a low resolution map that Inuit can navigate and basically use for hunting. The importance here being that, of course, Inuits are not this kind of romanticized idea or people that live independent of any technology. Of course, they live in, let's say, standards that we would consider normal, and they have access to technology, but some technology they actively reject. And for them, hunting is precisely one of those activities that is still very much culturally tied to their way of living. And so they generally would not prefer to just have kind of food shipped to them, but the idea that hunting is still something that wants to be executed and carried out, and in a way that still, to some extent, challenges the human and kind of is, let's say, maybe to some extent a rite of passage of sorts, means that the option to kind of make a low resolution map is precisely, or by making it a little bit noisy, let's say, and not making the resolution too high, allows that kind of line to exist where technology is entering into the culture without overriding it or completely altering the course that they might not respond well to. So here's a kind of project overview showing the different bits of ice in the data set, the pattern language that they've created, and some of the final outputs that they speculated on. So in a different angle, this is the non-human team, and they're looking at climate change maybe through the different lens. So if on the one hand, if the previous team, there was a lot of disruption being caused by the ice melting and migratory patterns of hunting animals changing. In this case, they're kind of looking at the opportunities afforded by climate change. So on the left here, you can see this map of Alaska, and they've started kind of tracing out how Alaska's climatic zones are going to evolve over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and how certain parts of southern Alaska will eventually start to feel like Barcelona. With this, they basically identified these areas called ecological transition zones, and those are areas where the ecology is effectively changing, but it is not yet fully defined. So it's basically area for opportunity. But at the same time, they look at not from the angle of a human, but from the angle of the non-human. That is to say, the living animals and plants on the territory. And they compare, let's say, a human approach to a non-human approach, or they try to define what a non-human approach would be. But interestingly enough, they have to look into human-made laws that determine how these territories are either exploited or protected, and so on. And by using those laws, they generate a proposal around how sentient machines might enact certain actions onto the territory to act in the best interest of the territory, as opposed to in the best interest of the human. So here, this is the data set training for the identification of different landscape formations, and in this case, specifically looking to identify dried up ponds, because that's the material that they end up using to build. And those dried up ponds are usually very rich in mineral content and are a very good fertilizer. So they speculate on these machines that are able to carve out from these ponds and form different types of microhabitats for allocating certain types of ecologies or plants and attract certain types of animals in order to control the way in which the ecology takes place, or in the way in which the territory expands. And this is a little bit different than maybe how most people would like to conceive of it, meaning let's say it unapologetically accepts invading the territory and shaping it with intention, and kind of, again, removes this idea of a romanticized nature, but instead gives nature the autonomy to act in the same way that maybe humans might, or at least with the same capacity, but towards a different end. So this is one of those examples of the human laws that was very interesting to come across, which was that basically the Animal Welfare Act meant that Star Wars filming in this region could not actually do anything that would disrupt the appearance of these puffins. These birds over here are native to this area, and they're near extinction, or they're vulnerable. So Disney had to be very careful with how they filmed on site. And because they chose to stay in that location, they basically generated these porgs, which became the kind of CGI replacement for these puffins. So learning from how powerful the presence of a vulnerable species can be, the project kind of evolves on this idea of shaping the landscape in order to specifically attract certain types of species that kind of, again, play with humans against their interest, or maybe in the interest of the non-humans, but through human-generated laws. So the Earth team, or the Autonomous Transhumans team, is a little bit more sensitive in their approach, expanding on the mutual relationship between nomadic tribes and their reindeer, which is a very close relationship, because there's an economical, but an ecological, and a kind of cultural and territorial bond that exists through that type of relationship. So in this case, reindeer have terrible eyesight, but they have phenomenal smell. They can smell grass frozen beneath the snow, or frozen beneath ice. And they basically operate and navigate according to smells. So what they chose to do was to train machines on a library of different smells or different smell combinations that would allow these machines to kind of autonomously herd the reindeer into different territories, which again has implications for both humans, the reindeer, as well as the ecology at large. So here you can see the kind of tracing of these different smells and how even things like human excrement can actually be an attractor, and how different combinations can form different intensities of smell in order to herd the reindeer. And then they were playing with this idea of an episodic memory, basically that there is some relationship between past experiences and certain types of smells. So things like the smell of oil being pumped through the pipelines might be an undesirable smell that they can actually trace back to certain events. And throughout this process, the reason the herding is so important at this moment in time in that region is because with the ice melting, there are the formations of these pingos, which are mounds that are forming as methane that is frozen beneath the surface starts to expand. So as the gas expands, these mounds start to form, and as these mounds start to form, they have been reported to simply burst. And when they burst, they leave huge craters in the ground, but they also release, in some cases, anthrax, for example, which then infects the entire herd. So by identifying where these pingos are, which is part of the machine learning, they can effectively navigate the reindeer in and around certain territories. And maybe the last project that we'll go over is Decommissioning Svalbard. And this project looks at the paradox between environmental law and national sovereignty. So basically, Svalbard is the largest, well, Longyearbyen, which is the capital or the largest city in Svalbard, is the most northern city. And it is effectively Norwegian, but there's this kind of paradoxical scenario because people want, Norway wants to maintain sovereignty over the island. And in order to do that, people need to inhabit the island. But people living in such a region demand, of course, electricity and power, which is not the most environmentally friendly thing in the world. And at the same time, Svalbard has one of the strictest environmental laws. So we effectively have a paradox, and the students trying to figure out how do you mitigate this kind of paradox? How can you keep people on the island while kind of mitigating or dealing with this environmental law? So the project kind of looks at a digital mitigation where for different reasons, things like you can't import any new materials onto the site. They are effectively taking down buildings. So what they propose is a strategy for decommissioning existing buildings and recombining those parts into making new hybrid typologies that would kind of condense the city, but still allow people to continue living on the island. So here they're training the machine on different types of interiors and to recognize different types of materials and their potential use. And they sort them into this three-dimensional matrix according to their durability, their hardness, the size, and etc., and basically stores it into a catalog. And from those catalog of former building parts, new typologies can be generated, and different parts of different buildings can start to constitute a new hyper typology, let's say. In this case, they're experimenting with the one church on the island and the one fancy restaurant on the island, and kind of speculating on what would happen if the two had to merge in order to, let's say, economize both the materiality, but also reduce the footprint of the habitable area. So each of the projects, through decoding and recoding, they intentionally kind of maintain a lack of resolution in specific areas that amplifies the friction in the Arctic, generated by the simple fact that things are getting warmer and ice is starting to melt, and tries to project an imminent reality on what the future might start to look like. And with that, we would like to thank you very much for your attention. And if you're interested in knowing more about either of the projects, please feel free to visit monumentalwastelands.com or follicle.com to see the toxic cartography. Both of them are under construction, so maybe wait a little bit, but basically thank you very much for your time. And yeah, thank you Igor and Suman for having us, and Deborah.
I mean, I'm not sure if probably there are questions or something.
Yeah.
Thank you first of all for the great lecture. Really exciting and interesting work. I think what's probably interesting for the students is to understand what a kind of creative use of technology you guys employ in your work. What I find really interesting is kind of the shift, a radical shift of scales between, let's say, first half of the lecture and the second half, where you show how even on a very small scale of a pavilion, there is data that can be harvested and transformed into something very physical. But then with the work that you guys do at RC1, it's kind of totally flipped upside down, where like there's no, let's say, such a physical product as kind of something that we are used to, but there is still data to be harvested and used like in the most, let's say, unexpected areas. And like probably when you think about urban environment, you think about people flows and all these things. But what I really find fascinating in what you just presented is how you find the relevant data, let's say, in the most unexpected areas, like even kind of the way that the animals would behave, or because all of these are parts of the local ecologies and still the way of life. It's not only what we are probably used to while living in the cities. And yeah, I would definitely invite students to ask questions if you want to ask anything. Super interesting work. Or if
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I want to ask to Deborah. Do you think human hair can be insulation for architecture? If it's possible, it can save the environment, I guess, right?
I think the question is directed to me, right? Basically, I do think that human hair can be a material. I'm not sure if it's going to save us from anything, but I think there is a potential there. No, I mean, in our case, it's not directly into the application of it, like as a product, but it is much more like the research that we were developing through toxicity and so on. But we have seen already, working with Matter of Trust, how human hair can be clearly a potential for a material that has like very real implications, no? From sound proofing to growth material, to growth like as a substrate to grow other plants and so on. I do not know if Hadin, you want to elaborate on it.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of, let's say for us, one of the interesting things looking at human hair is the initial impulse that this thing that most people tend to grow all the time and on a large scale gets cut massively and then just thrown away. And it's really just trash, but it's very valuable trash. And that's kind of the first interesting point for us in that aspect, because it's not only trash, but it's also a bit, depending on what culture you're from, disgusting too, right? We found that in Thai culture, hair is supposed to be this very like precious thing that you take care of, but then you don't want to touch it when it's on the ground,
or when it's extremely rude if you are touching someone's hair. No?
Exactly.
That we also, it of course also has like racial implications, right? Like it's a very clear aspect that somehow different.
But then just from that very simple thing, hair, we kind of untangled so many different aspects. I mean, going into it, finding out that it actually contains all this information, and it's actually a kind of record of your own environment, right? So I mean, we're trying to map urban toxicity, through people's hair. So based on where you live, where you work, we can, in principle, cut a bit of your hair and determine where you've been exposed to certain, whether or not you've been exposed to high degrees of pollutants, and if so, maybe potentially trace back where that's happened to. So that's like, let's say it doesn't quite answer your question directly, but I think it kind of touches on the point that Igor was making, that maybe in this very simple thing, so many possibilities start to unravel, and it really comes from, in that case, the trash at the barbershop, right? Like this very, but there's lots of work and experiments to be done with it, definitely. We've seen people using it at least as a kind of fiber reinforcement. So, feel free, if you go to a barbershop and ask them for hair, you'd be surprised. They're very willing to give it to you. So don't be shy, just go and experiment.
Thank you. Very helpful answer for me. Thank you.
Anyone else, just feel free to ask anything, or you can also write in the chat. This also goes for anyone who's watching on YouTube, perhaps. You can just write the question and we will ask.
Hey, I wanted to know if that's a part of your research at the BPro, or is that a project from your architecture practice?
You mean follicle?
Yeah.
Like the human hair project? Yeah, that's separate work. No, the research cluster one is focused on the Arctic. And this project has been like, it has been like an ongoing project since we began. It was our first project and it's still ongoing. So, yeah.
Right. And how hard or easy is it to convince clients to build with material from the human body?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that this project was a competition in New York. Didn't make it. It made it to the very final state, and they decided no because it was too risky. Then, through a series of contacting a bunch of people, at the end, someone was interested, and at that time we were in Bangkok, so that was like possible through. I mean, I think that project was basically possible because it was in Bangkok and because. In Thai culture, like it coincides with a lot of multiple situations, no? A lot of pollution in Bangkok during the Bangkok Design Week. We were trying to do this project and suddenly like the event coincided precisely with this, no? So everyone was extremely keen to go in and donate hair because they were extremely worried on what was the effects on pollution on their own body. So at the beginning, it was really hard, but now since it has been done, it's like already kind of having his own life. Like more people are interested into it and so on. So at the beginning it was hard, yes, to convince, but now it's fine.
I mean, actually, in fact, for the competition, we passed the first stage, and at the second stage, they came back with several questions. And one was to make sure that legally speaking, we could make something out of human hair in a public space. And it's quite funny because hair by itself is not anything, right? It's like it's not toxic. It's just disgusting to some people. So because of its kind of appearance in that way, the jury felt that we needed to make sure that legally speaking, it is okay. And in fact, it's very okay, legally speaking. There's absolutely nothing.
And of course, we didn't find there was not any public law or rule that was saying that human cannot be used, of course, no. But through our research and talking to multiple people, we came out like there is no problem to use human hair. It is just our perception of it that we don't like.
Anyone else?
And also, I asked you about the project about the emotional installation. Yeah, actually, it is relative in my design thesis, just I submitted, and yeah, for that I see the possible that if the machine, what should I say? Machine think the person is look tired, then the transformable machine can make chairs or some sitting areas for the person. Is it possible? Is it possible, right?
I think so. I mean, you're saying if, I mean, just to kind of program a response to a certain expression, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but
Because
yeah, go ahead.
because I read some researches, articles, but it's only some theories. But actually, I saw the actual installation project through your project, so I think it's awesome.
I mean, we have to understand that in our case, we were like basically analyzing emotions that in somehow were simplified emotions. No, it was like, which in itself is like quite happy for what and so on. So there was like 5 emotions that we were analyzing. And if you were specifically like searching to transcribe or to decode being bored, probably something that you need to like basically understand what are the parameters that control it and how do you read them, which I think it might be different to the parameters that we used in our case.
Okay, we have also a question from YouTube, so I'm just gonna read quickly. Osvaldo is saying, if I think about the first satellite image, how noise or technological error can be a possible condition? What meaning does fiction or error or non-real have in your projects, considering that technology is part of their practice from manufacturing to deep learning? How do you work with them? Is there a process to track them? So I can also...
Yeah,
It's a little
put
bit
it in
long.
the chat. It's a little bit long. Yeah.
Yes, I will copy it in the chat as well, so you can have it. It's easier. Yeah, it's quite a long question. But thank you, Osvaldo.
I guess this addressed the title, no? I mean, we are always playing with this idea of what is real, what is not real, what is noise, what is signal. And the point is that sometimes when you start to consider something that is detected as noise as something that is actually a signal, is when it starts to become relevant and when it starts to like basically provide different readings that you didn't consider before. So, I mean, I guess that can be a meaning to it.
I mean, I find that I'm skeptical as a person of everything. So the value of let's say for anything to be real in a way is also the value for anything to be fictional or in a way. So somehow this the role of fiction, I think, can't be overlooked or overstated, and especially when one of our previous lectures was kind of based on the amount of hype or hysteria generated by an erroneous news report that that basically of something that never actually happened, right? But it was able to exist long enough that people referred back to it as a documented thing in history until it was found out that it wasn't actually.
Should we explain a little bit which one we are? Because
Sorry, maybe it's a bit obscure.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, do I explain or you explain?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So, I mean, there is like the Great Horse Manor crisis that happened in the late 19th century, I believe. That basically, I mean, what was said, and told, I think it was in which newspapers was, but basically it has been referred in many media and many newspapers, like this Great Horse Manor crisis that generated the appearance of the car as a result, like London or New York were going to be filled with manure, and then something had to come out as an innovation that basically was going to resolve this problem, and then the car happened. And then this news started to roll, so everyone was like quoting the Great Horse Manor crisis, but when someone suddenly started to track when was that crisis happening, it never happened. But there were like series from politicians to newspapers to climate change to innovation. Like there were like a whole amount of topics that were using this quote, that actually was a fiction, or it was fake news. But it became very real, and it became like a source for justifying or somehow explaining and presenting certain things that were happening currently right now. No? Hadin, so you.
Yeah. No, so that's it. I mean, policy, real policy that changes the way we live can obviously be created by a kind of fictional scenario that gets consumed by the masses, right? And that we see all the time, right? There's no need to talk about election processes and so on. So that's always a part of the process. But for us, I think also as well, there's an aesthetic component to this idea of the noise or the indiscernibility or the kind of lack of clarity in something. And maybe that has something to do with generally being over things being able to be so detectable for what they are. I think we are kind of drawn to things that we don't always quite understand. And I think being able to play on that gives us the chance to build up some emotional connection, which I think is fine to say. But basically, to be interested in something, sometimes it's also to not be able to fully comprehend it or understand it. And that can also be communicated, visually or tactily or experientially. And I think those types of engagements are the ones where we start to experience something new. And in the case of, let's say, the Dear Romantic project, there was specifically no goal. There was absolutely no, this is what we're trying to get and this is what we're trying to prove. It was simply just, we have no idea what this is going to produce, and we're very curious to see how this might become a starting point for something.
Somehow also talks about the ways in which we evaluate if something is successful or is not, and how we probably try to locate ourselves outside of this kind of binary approach, which I think is also related to the way in which we try to communicate our projects, that it is not like extremely didactic, but that somehow what we try is to somehow search for different lectures, that it doesn't only provide like a streamline of the understanding of our work.
Yeah, I mean, or you could even imagine it that essentially, like, until you harvest a lot of this data, it is quite fictional just thinking about it, because it is, some of it does really sound really strange when you think about it, like, how could I use this in architectural practice or beneficial to the urban environment or so on. So until you actually harvest that data, it is quite fictional until you actually understand what to do with it, which I find very fascinating. And I think maybe that's also kind of something very interesting for the students regarding the brief of the whole school and the workshop as well. Just understanding the potential that the hidden data, but not just kind of the one that is found in the urban environments, but rather also behavioral, and what benefit it can have to shaping the environment. So anyone else, guys, if you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. I think you just talked about it a bit. I mean, how do you evaluate projects dealing with memory and emotions after you did them, maybe in the process, but also afterwards? Because they're hard to evaluate. I mean, you can track them maybe, or you can look for new responses, which is interesting. But I'm wondering, like, after you did a project, how do you evaluate it?
Sorry.
For me, I don't know. We might have different answers on it, but that's always interesting too. But I mean, it's tricky, right? Because, for example, when you're presenting a project, so like, let's say an academic conference of sorts, then you need to usually substantiate it with some type of evaluation, some type of data, right? Some type of measurement that points to this is why, and it's some kind of objective analysis, right? That kind of went through a series of evaluations and measurements, and then it's all said and done. And that is definitely one way to go about it. But of course, something like memory and so forth is course, tricky and obscure, which is why we also know that, for example, in the case of the Dear Romantic project, that maybe at the end of the day, we're not even getting emotions, right? We're just getting these kinds of signals, but we don't know, right? At the end of the day, how you really feel. I mean, it's kind of tricky to even identify somebody as being happy, right? Like, how does that mean? And you could probably be experiencing mixed emotions at any given point in time. We've all seen that somebody happy, crying, I don't know, kind of mixed emotions, right? So it's not so clear cut, that's for sure. But I think, at least from my side, the part that for me to evaluate whether or not it's successful is quite simply if I like it or not at the end, right? Like, if it has if it continues to leave a kind of interest moving forward, and something that maybe wants to be revisited later. And there's definitely some projects that I don't feel that way towards, but then there are some that continue to kind of resonate in a way. So there's definitely some kind of super bias, maybe inexplicable quantitative way of determining whether or not I like something. And I think it's becoming more and more acceptable to simply kind of be not entirely like that, not entirely to say that this is what I like and therefore it's fine. You should be able to kind of argument it to some extent and try to prove something, because it has to be able to be communicable and kind of make sense to the other person, right, at the end of the day. So you have to communicate it through some kind of medium, or statistics or something that somebody can absorb. But I think it's a bit of both. And I think that's kind of maybe related to the point that Deborah mentioned before as well, where it's tricky because we don't really view the things as so binary. There's no absolute, this is successful. There's areas in which it's maybe successful and areas in which it could have been improved. And for most projects, let's say. But it's definitely a tricky one, but yeah.
Probably something that I find, I mean, I was thinking, how, if I had to repeat that project, what will be like the things that work and things that didn't work, or in what I would probably spend like a little bit more of time, no? And probably is related with this kind of idea of dividing, in this case, the emotions. We are talking about the romantic, no? So we were having like 5 emotions, and those were like the ones that we were focusing on. But I think that the interesting moment, it comes when we are not able to read, when we are outside of those 5 emotions. So probably the success is into realizing that this kind of, let's say, target that we were having at the beginning, by which if we were able to make the computer to understand that I'm happy, that was a success. Suddenly that is like becoming extremely like predictable. But the point it was, okay, so what are like the moments in which those emotions can be more complex and cannot be understood, and how like basically the outcome would respond to it. So to some extent, I think that the success is the unsuccessfulness, that what we were planning at the beginning is actually what we don't want anymore. Like what we were trying is like for the next.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. If there are no more questions, we can wrap this up slowly, so students can get a bit of a break before the next tutorial session. So last chance, if someone has a question, now is your time. No? Okay, so thank you very much again, Deborah and Hadin. Really wonderful lecture and great discussion afterwards. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I mean, especially thanks to Sumin, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
I'm just jumping in here to help. I'm different a bit, right, as it's easier. Anyway, thanks a lot, and I hope the students and participants also enjoyed. It was really inspiring lecture.
Thank you so much.
Knowing your work, it was still great to see it as a kind of a holistic approach. Anyway, we're gonna end the stream now as well, and I believe students, now you can get a bit of a break, and then the next session with Hanjun starts in, I guess, 45 minutes or so. So thanks a lot once again.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye
Good
bye.
luck, guys. Bye.
Good luck. Bye.